Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Today, I just want to take a moment to send out a word of thanks. We would like to acknowledge those of you who are taking time to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or to send notes of encouragement to our team. I recently met with a listener in Western Canada who said he really enjoys these programs during his morning commute to work. Episodes are just the right length, he said, from my front door to my workplace, and I get a complete topic, which often gives me lots to think about. So a big shout out to Todd with thanks for his encouragement to our team. Maybe there's someone to whom you might recommend this program. We would love to have your help in getting the word out. And we're also open to suggestions for upcoming topics and guests. So if you've got an idea that our team should consider, please let us know. info@globalmissionspodcast.com, and you can find the links on the website. Now, here's today's conversation. Our guest today is David Jacob, who has been a missionary in Northern Asia and currently serves at Trinity Bible College and Graduate School in North Dakota. He there is the missionary in residence and the chair of the Intercultural Studies Department. He is the founder and director of the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention. And he's an author. He had a recent book in 2019 entitled It's Your Call to a Missional or Missionary Life. And Dave, I love that you included the idea of retention in the title of your center, the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention. Dave and his wife, Angie, have been married for 26 years. And we just talked about this before we started to record. Among the 5 children, his son and daughter-in-law are looking forward to a grandchild arriving. That's going to be really special. Dave, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Mags. Great to be discussing this topic with you today.
Well, we want to begin here. Tell us just a little bit about the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention. And I'm particularly curious why you included that element of retention as well. But where did this idea come from?
Yeah, so I was a missionary serving in a sensitive country in Northern Asia, and me and a colleague, we would take prayer walks around the city. It was 10K, 6.2 miles around the city. And once in a while, we'd get together and prayer walk and have a 3-way conversation with the Lord. And I just remember on one particular morning as I was walking down to meet him, so overwhelmed with the vast amount of people who had never even heard the name of Jesus in their own language. And it bothered me. And I said, this should bother more people. And so that's really the first thing that kind of gave me a burden for mobilizing and recruiting more missionaries to the field. If you fast forward a couple years, I was at grad school here at Trinity studying missional leadership. And one of my classes was generational succession. And it was really who's going to take your place in ministry. Most of the students in the class were pastors. And so it was kind of taught through that pastoral lens. But here as a missionary in the course, I was thinking, who's going to take my place? And am I doing enough to raise up the next generation of missionaries? And so that led to a thesis about mobilizing millennials. And then that led to the founding of the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention.
That's a great scan of the pathway. You've included the idea of retention. Just comment. We're going to talk mostly about mobilization today, of course, but just comment on this retention idea.
Well, if we're going to mobilize and work to mobilize more to the field, we have to address this retention concept and issue. As we know, missionary attrition is rather high right now. And 71% of those who leave the field prematurely leave for preventable causes. So the amount of time, effort, and finances that it takes to mobilize a family to the field, we're simply a revolving door if we don't focus on retention and keeping them healthy and thriving while they're there on the mission field. So mobilizers should also address this issue of retaining missionaries as they're mobilizing people to the field, and talk about what kind of things that they do, that they have in place in order to help retain our missionary force.
Well, if you're a regular listener of this podcast, you know that we spend, a fair amount of time, several episodes on missionary care and how we can take great care of those who have gone out as God's servants sent out by our churches. Having said that, Dave, maybe there will be another topic to unpack someday on retention and how it complements. Today, we'll spend most of our time talking about mobilization, and in particular, how missionaries who are currently serving and maybe on home service, it may be called something different. Sometimes it's called furlough or home assignment, whatever that term might be, when they're back in their sending nation, sending context. How can those people effectively participate in mobilization? So, Dave, let's jump in and just talk about, why is this so important? Why should churches and missionaries be considering strategic ways to involve missionaries themselves in mobilization?
Well, I've heard several mission leaders say that missionaries are our best mobilizers. And so I began to think about that and look for resources on how is this done? How do missionaries mobilize others? And didn't find anything really on that topic. And so I just thought, if mission leaders are saying that missionaries are our best mobilizers, and there's no book or few articles that really address this topic, then this is something that we're missing in the missions mobilization field. And so I just began to kind of look into this, and ending up right now writing my PhD dissertation on the missionary as mobilizer, and just discovering some fascinating things about how God often uses missionaries to mobilize others. And so if we're going to increase the mission force that is sent around the world, this is really an underutilized aspect of missionary mobilization.
I really appreciate that you're putting some, some rigor to the examination of the question, because anecdotally, I've heard that as well, both from pastors, and it was my experience, together with Kath's as a missionary overseas, that many of our colleagues came because they knew someone, they had talked to someone who was previously involved in missions. That was probably, undoubtedly not the only element, but a very significant element in the journey, in the discernment that they themselves would serve. So,
yeah, and most missionaries would say that if you ask them about their call story, when talking to missionaries about how God called them to serve long term, many of them do mention the significant influence of a career missionary who either came to their church, or they met on a short-term trip, or that they heard a sermon at a convention or their college, And so this is something that anecdotally we can note, but also there are several studies that do discover that this is an actual occurrence, and that missionaries really are effective at mobilizing others. But unfortunately, little has occurred as a result of some of these studies. And so hopeful that our conversation today will spur some ideas on how we can use missionaries to mobilize more.
I'll ask a little bit more about your research in just a minute, but I wonder, do you get a sense that the mission workers themselves, the missionaries themselves, do they have a clear sense of just how strategic their participation is? Do they own this yet?
I think a select few maybe do, but I would say from my perspective, the majority don't. They don't understand their influence. And what I've observed, most missionaries who are back on home assignment or furlough itineration, they are concerned about one thing, and it's a great thing because it's a good motive. They're concerned about raising those funds so that they can get back to the field. Unfortunately, missionaries say, I got to get back to the field where God has called me, Well, God has also called you to itinerate, to be on furlough. He's called you. This is why some agencies are calling it home ministry assignment, because it is a ministry. And what we're discovering is that is extremely more important than you raising your funds to get back to the field. So while that is valid and it's a great motive and we want those funds to be raised, there's something bigger at stake here. And that is the mobilization of more missionaries 5, 10, maybe 20 years down the road.
Well, again, on this podcast, if you're a regular listener, you'll know we talk about mobilizing goers, more missionaries, and mobilizing senders, people who might not necessarily move physically, personally to a mission field, but are supporting financially, yes, prayerfully, and in other ways, supporting God's work. So this is a great opportunity just for us to think together. Most of our listeners, Dave, will be from home churches, or many of them anyway. And so they may have an opportunity to interact with a home service missionary and maybe stir some of these ideas as well. So please take us to a little bit of your learning and your research that you've done. What have you observed? And what do we need to hear about when it comes to missionaries being more active in mobilization?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of practical tips that maybe we can get to in a little bit, but I think it's important that we understand how this occurs. So when a missionary comes to speak at your church, just them being there is extremely influential. And actually, members of the congregation observe them. And this seems to be of at least the same amount of impact, or some studies say greater impact, than when the missionary gives an inspirational sermon, or, we call it like a 5-minute window in the service. It's really their observance of character where congregation members say, I want to be like that. I want to have that kind of faith. I want to have that kind of passion. I want to have that kind of sacrifice in my own life. And they admire it, which is perhaps part of the reason why missionaries are often put on pedestals. But as missionaries come in and they share, some of them not being good communicators, just ordinary people, this helps send a message that you don't have to be super spiritual. In fact, missionaries are not super spiritual. We have weaknesses and sin in our lives that we deal with as well. And so when a missionary can be observed as just an ordinary person with some of those weaknesses, but yet God is using in incredible ways overseas to share the gospel, oftentimes this is the first thing that a member of the congregation is thinking about and is observing when a missionary comes in to visit.
The word that comes to my mind is authenticity. You're describing that someone is a real person and not an ideal person, faithful, we trust, but not perfect. You mentioned the opportunities that missionary workers have to report, and sometimes it's just 5 minutes, as you said. Talk to us just a little bit about the content. When a missionary has the opportunity to say something, the microphone, so to speak, and it might be just 5 minutes or maybe more, what do you see, what have you seen is effective to include in those windows of opportunity when it's, let's start with that more public facing, maybe it's before a congregation or a bigger group?
Well, a couple things. One, I would say it's important to impart vision and to talk about what could happen if we partner together. That's important for the missionary to do. What's also significant is missionary stories. These make a tremendous impact. I've talked to missionaries time and time again, who they're current missionaries, but before they would say, this missionary came and spoke at my church. I don't remember who they were, but they told this story about, that's what they remember. And if you study this kind of this neurotheology, I guess, or neuroscience of storytelling, it impacts our brains. And God uses these stories of faith, of hope, of miracles, of vision, and sometimes of struggle even. Like you mentioned, we should be authentic. He uses these stories to to call others. And so missionaries who tell these stories, even if it's 5 minutes, and to be honest here, there are some missionaries who should probably only speak for 5 minutes. No offense, but that it really doesn't matter the length of time. It's really what you do during that time, and telling stories and imparting vision and talking about partnership and allowing the congregation to observe your character goes a long way to mobilize other people.
I really like how the idea of story intersects with authenticity. We don't mean to imply, of course, that stories should be embellished, or that's the best word I can think of, that's always success and look at this amazing response. But when that is intersected with authenticity, there's something that really rings through there.
Yeah, most definitely. And especially for the younger generations, they value transparency. Gen Z, millennials, they value that authenticity. And so if we're going to mobilize the next generation, we've got to be able to talk about, hey, there's some things in the missions realm that, perhaps in the past that have occurred that are not okay. And we need to talk about these things. And, I don't have all the answers either, but allowing that conversation to take place goes a long, long way to mobilize future generations.
I wonder, just sticking with the storytelling a little bit, I serve in an agency myself. There are other agencies we know and trust, or sending churches. I wonder how much help we are providing our workers as they come on home service to both identify and prepare great stories that are both authentic and, fit the vision and the fruit and God's transformational work. I wonder whether we could be more helpful there, maybe.
Yeah, there are some good tips and some resources out there as far as, being good storytellers. And certainly we can equip our missionaries to be better communicators and better storytellers. Here at the college, when I teach, I have a class called Senior Seminar, and it's my seniors, they're getting ready to graduate. And so we actually practice this in the classroom, is storytelling and imparting vision. And how can you briefly explain how God called you and how you got to this point? And so we study how to do a 3-minute window and to do it well and to be respectful of the time, right? And so we practice this in class and we role play, and the students get graded on, how they've prepared. And so these types of things are really, really important as we put our missionaries. You think about it, your missionaries are representing your agency. They're the ones who are really out there interacting with other believers in various churches. And so we want them to be trained well on communicating their call and communicating what God's doing around the world.
So storytelling, doing it authentically, doing it concisely. You said it so nicely, Dave, but frankly, there are some missionary speakers that just speak too long and they unwind the good value, I think, that has been accomplished sometimes. So we want to do it authentically, concisely. Great storytelling. What are some other elements you think we need to consider beyond the public speak?
Well, one of the things that we should work hard to facilitate is informal gatherings where the congregation can interact with the missionary or the missionary family on an informal basis. So right away, one of the things that as a church that you can do is, instead of putting a missionary up in a hotel, is to find a host home to be able to host them. Now, I understand, being somewhat of an introvert myself, that some of us missionaries want that and need that downtime when we travel, because we need that to refresh us. That's where we get our energy from being alone, right? But there's a greater thing at work here. And I've spent many a Saturday night up very late in the living room of a family telling stories about, eating some crazy bugs and things like that. These are powerful mobilization moments. And so it is these informal gatherings, these informal conversations that you can have with a family, with a teenager, with a younger person. Missionaries, anytime they go to a church, should be asking, can I speak with the kids? Can I speak with the youth group Sunday school class? Most missionaries are first called to the field when they're between the ages of 14 and 19. And so we need to get more missionaries into our youth groups, into youth meetings, youth Sunday school, but into children's church and children's services as well. but also creating these informal gatherings. So an ice cream social, or, what we call a potluck, right? After the service, as instead of just having the missionary and the pastor's family say, go out to dinner, it's more effective if you have something at the church and invite the entire congregation. So anything that you can do to create informal gatherings while the missionary is there, God is going to use this to speak to others.
I appreciate your comment about being introverted and appreciating time alone, and in fact, needing time alone to be healthy. Something that I have tried to do, because I wrestle with that myself, is I try to be present, to use, that idea of being with families, but then to intersperse a trip with times of quiet by myself. And so it might be at a church, but then allow also for a day or two, maybe a hotel stay, something like that, to regenerate or to generate in advance. And maybe there can be some mixing and matching of these things so that both can really take place. We want our people to be healthy, of course, too. You've started to get to some practical ideas. So let's just continue right on to that. What are some of the practical, specific steps? We'll take a break in a minute, but let's get a few maybe out and going before our break. What do you recommend that we consider when we want to stimulate and help?
Well, one of the things that maybe is out of the norm is if your church is holding a volunteer service day where maybe you're repainting the nursery or you're doing some type of project, invite missionaries to come and work alongside. Maybe it's just a church barbecue. It's a cookout at the park or something. Invite missionaries, not necessarily to speak, where they can if you'd like, but invite them to serve alongside members of your congregation. Introduce them to those children and young people who sense a call to the mission field, and allow them to have those conversations and have questions answered. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a church and had hot dogs and macaroni and cheese, with Brianna, who feels called to be a missionary to Asia. And so we had just great discussions, and I was able to give her a gift that I had brought from the field, and it just meant the world to her. It's a simple thing. But being able to serve alongside members of the congregation, involving missionaries in that as they're traveling through. Maybe you can't have them on a Sunday, but perhaps there's a Tuesday evening, where they could come in and serve alongside members of the congregation. These are important moments to get to know your missionary. It helps with missionary retention and missionary relationships, but God also uses them to mobilize other people from the church.
That's good. Volunteer opportunities right in the mix. Other practical ideas you would stimulate our minds with?
Well, I think missionaries can serve as consultants for church missions committees. This is, an important thing. And I would also recommend mission committees to include youth. I was a guest at a missions committee a couple months ago, and they had a youth representative named Michaela. And I just thought that, she was 17 and she brings in a whole different perspective. And so this is really important, but to involve missionaries in those meetings and in how you conduct the missions ministry of the church is important. And then I would also add, if there's any way that we can establish missionary mentorship programs where you're connecting aspiring missionaries to those with field experience, this is going to go a long way in mobilizing. Because here's what happens. We've got a lot of youth who feel called to become a missionary at, say, a Bible camp or a youth convention. And then ultimately what happens is this fire dies out. By the time they get to Bible college, they no longer think about it. And so we need a missionary mentorship program to fill this gap between when our young people are called to become missionaries and to where they can get the training necessary in order to help get them to the field. And so any ways that we can connect them with missionaries, of course, digitally, because missionaries live such, transient lives, is important. And our young people are digital natives. So perhaps there's ways that we can initiate some of these programs so that our young people don't lose this call that God has placed on their lives.
Oh, this sounds really good. And I agree. Some of it could take place at distance. Some of it could be during a home service or a furlough, that mentoring. I guess I would just say, in support of our mission workers who feel busy all the time, and furloughs are filled with activity and travel and all of this. I still think, though, I wonder what you think, Dave, a lot of missionaries would be delighted to be considered for a mentorship if they knew that it was going to be making an investment, not just kind of a random scatter shot, but just really investing in young lives, or maybe not so young, but interested people. I think that many missionaries would make space to create some priority for that.
I agree. And it doesn't have to be a lot, one or two people that you are mentoring as you travel and as you go from church to church, or maybe even as you are on the field. Can you connect with a young person? Can you allow some of your time to go towards mentoring the next generation of missionaries?
Well, in just a moment, we'll ask Dave to share some resources and a few closing thoughts. Before we get to that part of our conversation, we'd like to share with you this missions resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Your profession, your skills, your passions. It's you making disciples of the nations. Crossworld desires to help you engage the world's least reached marketplaces in the ways God has gifted you. Hear more about Crossworld right here on the podcast by listening to episode 109 called Making Disciples Through Our Vocations. To learn more about Crossworld and their global opportunities, visit crossworld.org. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we are back with Dave Jacob, the founder and director of the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention. Dave, we want to get to some resources. Many of our listeners will be serving in local churches across North America. Some are missionaries themselves as well, but really serving the sending church here. What are some of the resources that you have to recommend on this idea of missionaries being mobilizers?
We've got a lot of resources that are free on our website, missionarymobilization.org. And I'll just mention a couple of books here that I think are really important as far as studies that show that missionaries are great mobilizers and how we can use them as such. The first one is a book put out by Barna Group just recently called The Future of Missions. It's 10 questions about global ministry that the church must answer with the next generation. It's not a large book, but it's packed with information. The second one would be a book from 2016, I think, written by Jay Matenga and Malcolm Gold called Mission in Motion. Speaking frankly of mobilization. This one was a 10-year study. It's a little bit more academic and it's a little bit larger of a text, but it goes through mobilization accelerants, mobilization inhibitors, and the use of missionaries and how they are such great mobilizers. Another book I'd mention is Pipeline, Engaging the Church in Missionary Mobilization by David and Lorene Wilson. I know you know them, Mags. And then just a couple other things. Missionary Mobilization Podcast is a podcast that I host. And then we've also just put out a journal called the Missionary Mobilization Journal. In fact, we've just released a week or two ago, issue number 2 on the importance of diversity in mobilizing more missionaries. And so all those resources are available at missionarymobilization.org.
Thank you. And again, I'll just mention we do take show notes, and they will be available on the website at globalmissionspodcast.com. And Dave, as you mentioned, I'm familiar with a number of the resources that you've mentioned. It was only a few episodes ago that we had Dave and Lorene Wilson on, and they weren't talking about their whole book, but about mission trips that can help mobilize a church. And that book, Pipeline, it's a bright yellow book. If you're ever in the store, you're looking on Amazon for it, highly recommend that book. And just to go back to the first thing that Dave mentioned, the Future of Missions by Barna Group, our team in our office actually had a read through in that. And Maddie, who is she's on the production team for this podcast, helped lead our team through a reflective reading of that. 10 chapters, very accessible, and short chapters that a missions committee could use. You could read one of these chapters for each of your meetings and have a discussion on the topics, for example. Great stuff. That did lead to another episode, and we unpacked that with 2 of the Barna Research Group in a previous episode. I'll need to let the production team note that in the show notes to know which episode that was exactly. But some great reading there. I've got one more question for you, Dave, that we like to ask toward the end of every episode. But just before I do, if our listeners would like to contact you, learn more? You've mentioned missionarymobilization.org, but how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from your listeners. I always love learning and connecting with others and sharing resources. So you can reach me at djacob@trinitybiblecollege.edu.
Very good. And we'll make sure that that's in the show notes as well. And thanks for your availability and generosity to connect with folks, Dave. Really appreciate that. I like to ask at the end of a conversation like this, if you had the opportunity, Dave, to stand in front of a group of people comprised of pastors and missions committee members, sometimes it's not called a missions committee anymore, the Go team, but those people who want to do a great job of missions from their home church, and you could address them, what would you like to say to them?
Well, I think just to summarize, we've got to be more intentional about missionaries who visit our churches and using them to influence the kingdom. It's not just about raising their funds. And for any missionaries that are listening in, this would be my last word as well. It's so much bigger than raising your funds to get back to the field. And so if I can just close with a quick story, I was talking with a missionary who was a little upset that her funds weren't coming in, and she wasn't going to make the deadline that her agency set for her to get back to the field. And she's like, Dave, I don't know what to do. And I said, listen, it's okay. And this is why. Because maybe you're going to have to schedule some more church services over the next several months. And God knows that there's a little girl in that last church service that you're going to speak to. And God's going to use you to speak into her life. God wants to use you, missionary, to speak into her life to be a missionary herself when she grows up. And if your funds came in right now, today, you would never be at that service. And so perhaps this is one reason why God sometimes delays our budgets coming in, because there is a greater thing involved here, and that is the mobilization of more missionaries, the next generation of missionaries sent from North America and from the global South, from all over the world.
It's a great word, and trusting in the sovereign care of our Heavenly Father and guiding in these things. Dave, thanks so much for joining us today and for sharing with our audience. May the Lord bless you at the center and at Trinity as you serve there. We just really appreciate you being with us today.
Thanks so much, Mags. It's been a lot of fun.
Just before we sign off, I've got a quick update. During my conversation with Dave about resources, I mentioned a previous episode about the Barna research. Now, in post-production, I was able to confirm that it was episode 147 with Jason Thomas and Sarah Farley, 3 questions the church must answer about the future of missions. In that episode, we unpacked just 3 of the major topics in the new book, and it would provide you with a great sample of that material in case you're considering that read. If you're listening to this in the summer of 2021, remember to stop by globalmissionstoolbox.com and subscribe to get updates on our upcoming launch. And if you're listening at some point later, we invite you to stop by and check out the library of resources assembled for people who want to do an excellent job of global missions. Today's episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.